new study from the state treasurer's office finds that on a per capita basis, Vermont had the highest net in-migration of any New England state and the third highest rate in the U.S. last year.
I think as policymakers, it tells us that we really need to focus in on housing, and we really need to focus in on that housing for middle class and working class Vermonters to make sure they can continue to live and afford to live in Vermont.
Plus, with January's presidential inauguration rapidly approaching, we take stock of the potential impacts the Trump administration could have on Vermont. And a cannabis retailer files suit over the state's advertising rules. That and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Thanks so much for being with us. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It's Friday, December 13th. And joining us on the panel today, we have Wallace from 7 Days, Auditi Guha from VTDigger, and joining us remotely today, Howard Weiss-Tisman from Vermont Public. Thank you all so much for being here. And we've got a lot to talk about today. I want to start with some news that I found that was kind of surprising, actually. A study coming out of the Treasurer's Office finds that thousands more people moved to Vermont or were moving to Vermont than moving away. And we've been hearing so much about trying to attract people to the state. If you look at this graphic here, you can see that around the pandemic year of 2021, there was this huge upshoot. A lot of people were moving to Vermont then, and we heard about that. Then kind of a dip, but for last year, more than double the previous year, some 7,000 people moving into Vermont, more than that. This brings up the question, though, of where are these people living, Wallace, because we have heard so much about the housing crunch in Vermont. You've been writing about this in 7 Days, and tell us a little bit about, first of all, the impact that the Trump administration could have on housing as we move into this next year in the new administration.
Yeah, as you said, Vermont has a huge housing crunch. We really have a shortage of housing here, and people are leaving the state, or they're living with their parents, or they're living in housing that isn't necessarily what they would choose, or they're paying much more than a third of their income for the housing. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. It's material costs, it's labor costs, it's land, it's permitting, it's just the shortage is making the costs rise. But the Trump administration wants to impose tariffs on a lot of the materials that go into building housing, and that could have a big effect and drive costs up even higher.
Those materials are already pretty expensive without the tariffs even.
Materials prices went up a lot during the pandemic, and they are certainly one of the reasons why housing prices have actually doubled in the last few years. And Vermont does import a lot of its lumber from Canada, which is one of the countries that is likely to be targeted for tariffs. We send logs up to Canada and we get it back. We get the wood back as lumber. So I talked to a lot of people who are responsible for purchasing like large amounts of building materials for various companies in Vermont, and they weren't completely panicked. They said they're waiting to see what's going to happen. They said that they already have some local sources for materials, so they would be able to switch, but they said it would be more expensive. And then for public entities like Champlain Housing Trust, which is the largest real estate developer up in Chittenden County, because they get a lot of federal funding and federal tax credits, they are required to buy their building materials from U.S. suppliers already. So there are people that won't be affected by the tariffs because they're already buying within the country. And
like you said, we have to wait and see what's going to happen. I know Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada has tried to meet with the Trump administration about this, but certainly it's not off to a great start, and there's a little bit of enmity there already with the news of these tariffs coming in, right?
Yeah, and there's also talk of retaliatory tariffs. Yeah. I mean, some of these countries are going to feel as though they're being targeted, and then they could put tariffs on our exports. So one thing that businesses really like is certainty and predictability, and there hasn't been a whole lot of that lately anyway, and this is definitely throwing another piece of that question up. I mean, people who outside of the building materials, people who rely on imports from other countries like Twincraft, which makes soap and personal products in Vermont and employs 450 people, one of their founders told me that they import materials from 50 countries. And she said, even if we're not actually targeted for tariffs, any of those countries, the whole issue is going to just throw everything into a state of uncertainty, and it's going to cause a lot of change for people, even if they're not importing those.
Speaking of change, Ann, I know another thing that you've been digging into here is, of course, there's been a ton of talk leading up to the election about immigration and the hardline stance that the Trump administration is planning on taking. This is affecting colleges around Vermont, UVM, Middlebury. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, because they have foreign students and faculty. They have a lot of international people on their campuses. And I've noticed that nationally, a lot of schools have been coming out and putting their warnings to students, their advisories to students, saying you might want to get back here before January 20th. There might be a change in the rules. They're pretty discreet about what the way that they frame it, but they're saying you might want to make sure that you're back here in this time. And of course, a lot of the schools are already in session well before January 20th, which is the presidential inauguration day. Anyway, but there's a lot of scholars and students who are on study abroad programs and things like that moving around, so it could affect them. And Middlebury sent out an advisory to its students saying, just please be aware of what's going on. Please make sure that your documents are up to date, and also just be mindful of this upcoming date. And University of Vermont did something similar. They wrote to their students and their faculty and staff and said, please be aware, we're starting January 13th, but for those who weren't going to come back before the 20th, you might consider doing that.
It's an additional stressor for sure. Howard Weiss-Tisman, you've been writing about other potential effects that a new administration, the Trump administration, could have on Vermont. You've been doing a lot of reporting on broadband. How could this be affected?
Right. So Vermont is expecting this big chunk of money through this program called the BEAD program, BEAD, Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. This is a federal program that was included in the Biden Infrastructure Act. And it's a big chunk of money. To give you an idea, Vermont's total broadband build out is expected to cost somewhere between $500 and $600 million. And this chunk of money that Vermont is getting is $229 million. So, it's a good 40% of what the state needs for the complete broadband build out. And President-elect Trump has been very, very critical of this program. When I was reporting this story, I came across an interview he did for a podcast where he was commenting about these states that are spending millions of dollars to hook up some farmhouse at the end of a dirt road. And, that would be Vermont. That's what we're doing with this money. We're going down these dirt roads. So the whole program has really, because it's federal money, it's moving very slowly. Vermont is right on the precipice of starting it. So what state officials are really trying to move this thing along. Everything has had to be approved for this program, the application process, the decision-making process, but they're very close. They opened up the pre-approval process just last week or so. And they really hope once the money's here, we'll be fine. And there's not real fear this could happen, but it's a possibility. Again, President-elect Trump has criticized this program. So, folks are really keeping an eye on it and just trying to get this money into Vermont because it's so important for the broadband construction that's happening.
Howard, I want to do a quick follow-up on this here because I'm trying to figure out exactly what President-elect Trump's criticism of this is, because as he was running for election again, he was trying to pose himself as a champion of rural America, rural Americans. This is something, as you said, that Vermont has been trying to do for a long time, is to hook everybody up so that even if you are in a remote area, even if you are in a rural part of the state, you can have the same access to the internet that folks in the cities would have. What exactly is his complaint about this? He's saying that it's wasteful, or that, because again, this is affecting people that ostensibly, he was trying to get support for.
Yeah, a lot of it is just that. He doesn't think it's money well spent. Some people have speculated one option is Elon Musk has some ideas about how to reach some rural areas. He has a Starlink program. And so some people have said that if the BEAD money does not come to rural America, that another option would be to hook up the Musk system.
Okay, thanks, Howard. Auditi, Guha, I want to turn to you now. You've been writing about, of course, another thing that's on a lot of people's minds with a Trump administration coming in. Civil rights, reproductive rights as well in Vermont. Vermont has reproductive rights enshrined into its constitution, but is there a threat to that?
Well, it remains to be seen. Advocates are deeply concerned at the attacks on reproductive rights nationally, and Trump has said in his campaign trail that that may be something that he might be focusing on curtailing. And if there is some kind of a federal law that makes that happen, the danger is that it could supersede state laws, and in which case, yes, Vermont would be affected, even though the state currently has strong protections for reproductive rights.
Trump has said that he is not for a national federal ban. He's been saying he wants to leave it to the states, but again, there are others behind the scenes that are pushing for exactly that thing. Okay. This brings us to something else that you've been writing about, Audie, and this is Vermont's Human Rights Commission came out recently and said, hey, we're having trouble dealing with cases. We don't have the staffing. We don't have the capacity. What are they saying is the problem here?
Well, the Human Rights Commission, actually, this is the first time in their history, they told me, that they are putting out a public appeal for more funding. And part of the reason is ever since their fiscal year started, July 1st, their number of complaints has just leapt up so much to the point that they have more than 100 cases pending that they have to even look at, intakes, as they say. And they have turned away 47 cases already because they just don't have the capacity.
So they're asking the Scott administration to pony up some more money, or the legislature? I mean, is that money really there? We know what kind of a crunch there is in Vermont fiscally.
Well, that's exactly what they're asking for, and they're really rallying with advocates around the state for that to happen. It would, of course, depend on the budget season and the mood of the legislature, but their ask is not small. They're almost doubling their budget. They want 7 new positions and the resources to the tune of about $800,000 more.
And as you're saying, this is the first time in their history they've publicly lobbied for this kind of extra funding, right?
Yes, and the reason is that they're seeing more discrimination complaints from around the state. And remember that those come from the most marginalized and most vulnerable of Vermont's population. A lot of the complaints, actually going back to Anne's story, is about housing. So a lot of fair housing complaints that they feel that they really need to get to protect Vermont residents and Vermont laws.
And again, bringing this back to the incoming Trump administration, is there concern too on the Human Rights Commission that there could be even more cases they have to deal with, given what could happen federally?
Unfortunately, that is the feeling, yes. Multiple civil rights organizations across the state have been putting out statements asking people to be aware of their rights, knowing where to call. This includes Planned Parenthood, Outright Vermont, because the attacks on trans people are expected to get worse, along with many others, and immigration advocates. So there's definitely strong concern, and a lot of human rights groups such as ACLU are ready for the fight. They said, we've been here before, and we have our resources and we have our people to hit the ground if needed. Okay,
thank you for the update on that. Let's bring things back locally for a moment. Howard, you were covering a meeting in Brattleboro. I believe just last night there was a heated debate in Brattleboro last night over community conduct and whether there should be an ordinance to deal with it. And we have some sound from that meeting.
If I'm homeless and I'm addicted to fentanyl or heroin and I'm dope sick and I'm desperate for money and I'm panhandling outside the co-op and a police officer comes along and under this ordinance issues me a Class A violation with a $200 fine, what's the point of that? I can't pay a fine.
We are here in large part because our downtown has a perception of absolute erosion. Now, Nobody at this table ever blamed anybody who was unhoused. Nobody at this table looks to criminalize poverty. Nobody. So I just want to make that clear. This is all things that the people who are opposed to this ordinance have interjected on this conversation, and it has no place here. We had 3 or 4 select board meetings in a row where 100+ people begging this board to do something and do something quickly was in occurrence. And it has been my understanding that there's been only one other time in the history of select board meetings where something like that has happened, and that was for one meeting. This happened 4 or 5 times in a row.
Howard, a lot of tension there. That gentleman was saying absolute erosion in Brattleboro when it comes to community conduct. What is he talking about? What's going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, those 2 clips really told us a lot. That last person we saw, that was Peter Case. He's a member of the select board. And Brattleboro, just like a lot of towns across Vermont, Burlington, Montpelier, Bennington, Rutland, you name it, are seeing more drug use, more folks experiencing homelessness, just a lot of activity out in the street that for a lot of us who have lived in Vermont for a long time, we just haven't seen before. What Peter Case was saying there is that this summer, they heard from a bunch of downtown business owners who are just really frustrated with their windows being broken, with folks coming in and shoplifting. And as Peter said, there were a series of meetings where a lot of people came out and said, please do something. And so what the select board did is they passed what they call the acceptable community conduct ordinance. It's convoluted, but basically it gives the police power to issue civil fines instead of criminal fines. So this wouldn't be more arrests. This would be fining people for trespassing, for drinking, for drug use. There's a list of things. The select board passed that in September, and then a petition was quickly raised forcing a town vote on it. And that's what you saw there. That meeting was held last night. Brattleboro does a thing called representative town meeting. They're the only town in Vermont that does this. So it wasn't a townwide vote, but the representatives voted and this ordinance was overturned. As we heard from that first person, there was a lot of people saying that this ordinance criminalizes poverty, that it really won't do anything to address the issues of homelessness and opioid addiction and everything else. So there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of, as you heard, really heated and emotions on both sides of this issue. And I don't know where it goes from here. As I was reporting this out, it looks like St. Albans also just this week passed a similar ordinance for properties, so that police that respond continually to the same properties, the town now is allowed to approach the landlord and talk about it. So it's a big issue. It's happening all over Vermont, and there are no easy fixes.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's not the last that we're going to be hearing about all of these issues. And I want to turn to you now to a story that I find really fascinating, and this is about a lawsuit that's been filed over the state's cannabis advertising rules. This came from a cannabis retailer in Middlebury, I believe.
Yeah, Dave Silberman, who's a veteran of the industry. He's very well known. He was one of the leaders in getting cannabis sales legalized in Vermont. And when the Cannabis Control Board did legalize the sales, a lot of the people in the legislature were a little bit hesitant about the impact that they were actually quite hesitant about going ahead with this and wondering what the impact would be on the community. So one of the things that they did was say that any advertising has to be cleared with the Cannabis Control Board, and their intent is to make sure there's no sort of Joe Camel type figures that appeal to kids. But the end and also there's a long, if you advertise on the radio, there's a 30-second spot warning of the dangers of using cannabis. And Silberman's lawsuit argues that this is really bad for the industry because it takes a while to get things approved. So if you're responding quickly to something on social media, the way advertising works these days, it's hard to do anything quickly. Mm-hmm. And it makes radio advertising, he says in his suit, too expensive because of that 30-second spot that also would turn listeners off.
And the point has been made too that there are other industries, alcohol, right, tobacco, sports betting, which is new in Vermont now, that don't have these same kind of advertising restrictions, right?
That's right. I mean, it really speaks to the way that cannabis has captured the public's imagination for decades. This is a sort of dangerous and subversive substance that needs to be controlled in ways that alcohol, for example, as you said, doesn't.
And James Pepper is the chairman of the control board that deals with cannabis. I guess what he was saying was, you know, I can't do much about this. Yes, I'm in control of the board, but I didn't write the state laws that are dealing with this.
And in fact, the lawmakers would have to make any changes to the advertising rules.
One other question, though, and maybe Dave Silberman addressed this or not, I was a little surprised in part because what I figured was, look, you know, cannabis has been legal now in Vermont for what, a year or two?
Yeah.
Is it 2 years now?
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it seems to me like if people want to get high, if they want to access cannabis, they would find a way. Why do they need the advertising so much, I guess?
That's a great question. And yes, they always found a way long before this was legalized, and a lot of people are still going around the legal market. But for these businesses to be part of the legal system and to be regulated the way in the legal system, they need the advertising because they need to compete against each other successfully, just like any regulated business would.
Yeah. Howard Weiss-Tisman, you've been writing a little bit about cannabis employee education, because I understand that a lot of the medical marijuana shops are going to be closing down now because people can just access on a retail level. What do they want to educate folks about here?
Yeah, right. So this is really interesting. As you said, Vermont legalized medical cannabis long before the adult use shops opened. And now that cannabis is available all over the state, the medical only shops are having a tougher time staying in business. A couple have closed. Also next year, adult use shops are going to be allowed to apply for a medical license. The medical cannabis is more potent. Folks that use it for medicine are able to buy it. They're not taxed. So the Cannabis Control Board is facing the very real challenge that people are going to be coming into these adult-only shops and asking for advice. They have a headache, they have a back injury. What can you recommend I use? And so the Cannabis Control Board is trying to get ahead of that. The Vermont Medical Society has some real issues with this. Of course, while cannabis is used medicinally, it's not FDA approved. And so the Cannabis Control Board is trying to walk this line of providing training. They're kind of equating it to liquor. You know, liquor stores have training and doing the same kind of thing. So they're trying to, you know, walk that line about making sure that the folks that work in the cannabis shops are educated, that they're not giving out medical advice, but for the people that work in the shops, they do have resources to at least spare the folks who are looking for input on different strains, sativa, indica, et cetera. So it's an interesting issue, and it's going to be kind of rolling out over the next couple of months.
Audie, I wanted to ask you about a new program that is supporting Vermont employers that are seeking a more diverse workforce. What's happening there?
Well, the Vermont Professionals of Color has found a need and a problem in the state where, as we've talked about how many people are coming in and the housing crisis that continues, they have found that when companies do hire diverse candidates, those people have a very hard time adjusting to Vermont. And the same organization said that they know of people who leave because they haven't been able to adjust or meet people or find housing in Vermont. And so for employers who want to retain diverse candidates, this organization has come up with a really unique program. They're calling it the Newcomer Nexus. So if you were a company, say, hiring somebody from out of state who doesn't have friends or family or a connection in Vermont but has a job, you could use this program for a fee to pair this person up with a local person who might sort of act as an ambassador or a friend and help this person find a lot of things that aren't easily Googleable, you know, that are maybe very community-oriented local things that are hard to find.
And briefly, you've been writing about the plan to sell Montpelier's downtown building, that empty building now because of all the flooding. What's going on there?
Yeah, it's the big federal building at a prime location right in downtown Montpelier, and it was the site of the post office for many years, and it has a broad plaza in front where a lot of people, they'll have their demonstrations there, or the neighbors will have conversations, and it was just a very central community hub for the town. And like many buildings in Montpelier, it was closed overnight by a devastating flood in July 2023. And it has sat empty while people have wondered what is going on, and the feds have not been very communicative about it. They own the building. Eventually, I mean, more than a year and about 15 months after the post office closed, the U.S. Postal Service opened another post office, but the questions have remained about the building, which has water in its elevator wells and is in need of a ton of work to be and floodproofing to be made useful again. So now it's owned by the General Services Administration. They said they're going to work with the community to find another use for it.
Okay. We have to close here with, as we go to tape, we don't know the score of the UVM versus Denver semifinal NCAA men's soccer tournament game. I'm going to say UVM won. Yanov Bazzini perhaps scored the game-winning goal. Let's hope that's the case as we go to air. And tomorrow, if you got nothing else to do and you look like Bernie Sanders, go to City Hall Park at noon. There is a Bernie Sanders lookalike contest. Senator Sanders announcing this will be likely his last term, by the way, in office. He'll be 89 years old when his Senate term is up. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much to our panel, Ann Wallace Allen from 7 Days, Auditi Guha from VTDigger, and joining us remotely today, Howard Weiss-Tisman from Vermont Public. Thank you all so much. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next week on Vermont This Week.